And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you. I am Gary Michuta, your host and sensei for this hour, where we're going to investigate how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. It's great to be with you today. Before I forget, why don't we switch things around? I'm going to give my shout-outs to all those watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. And I also want to welcome all of you listening on radio around the country and around the world via podcast. Welcome aboard, everybody. Got a great show in store for you. In fact, we're really going to change things up. We haven't done this so far in our history here at Hands-On Apologetics. Most of our focus has been Scripture, has been theology, doctrine, and history. You know, that's been the main focus because when you're explaining defending the faith, these are important components. But we haven't done anything with social teachings, which is also very important. You know, although Christ didn't give us in the deposit of faith exactly a blueprint on how we ought to be governed, nevertheless, within the gospel, within that deposit of faith, there are some principles that can be drawn out as to whether certain ways of governing can comport and support the dignity of human beings, or whether some governmental structures could be detrimental to human dignity and flourishing. And so today we're going to tackle a topic that I think is going to come up a lot, and it's going to be part of defending the faith as well, and that is, can a Catholic be a socialist? Because although there are certain principles in social teaching, you know, the church has occasionally stepped out and made pronouncements on certain forms of governing that is an affront to human dignity. And so we're going to have Dr. Catherine Pakaluk come on. She co-wrote a book with our friend Trent Horn. By that title, Can a Catholic be a Socialist? The answer is no. And here's why. And for those watching live stream, you'll be able to see that cover up on your screens. She's going to be joining us on the other side of the break. So I'm looking forward to our discussion on that because, like I said, it's definitely a topic that's very timely. You know, oddly enough, I began doing apologetics back in the early 90s. Things like that just weren't on the radar screen. It was mostly dealing with Protestant fundamentalism, things like that. But, you know, the landscape has so changed here in America that there's all sorts of different kinds of areas that we would never have thought about, you know, as apologists, back then. For example, atheism, non-belief, this kind of militant relativism, and now you have like the resurgence of socialism. So what does the church teach on socialism? Can you be a socialist and a Catholic? Catherine Pakaluk is going to join us on the other side of the break to help answer those questions. That's going to be a lot of fun. And also we have our Finding the Fallacy for today. You know, every episode we look at a informal fallacy, a way of wrong thinking or arguing, just so that we can be familiar with these wrong ways of thinking, so that when it occurs in our dialogues, we'll know how to handle it, how to diffuse these broken arguments, I guess you could say. And today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is the Furtive Fallacy. And we also meet an early church father. We had a couple of big ones last couple of episodes. We had Pope St. Clement of Rome. And then we had St. John Damascene, or St. John of Damascus. Today's early church father, I would venture to guess that practically no one, unless you're in the field of apologetics, would know him. It's St. Dionysius of Corinth. St. Dionysius of Corinth. So I actually enjoy those installments of Meet the Early Church Fathers when they're lesser known people. You know, it's kind of neat to find out about these, our forefathers in the faith, I guess you could say, that have kind of slipped off the radar screen. Most people don't know about them. Well, you're going to know about them today. And let's see. Okay, I gave my shout-outs. I also want to mention that if you want to listen to this program, maybe you're going out for lunch or coming in for lunch, you can't catch the whole program, never fear. You can always download it as a podcast via either our website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org, or you can also download it through our handy-dandy phone app, which is available out there. Just download it, and you have access not only to Hands-On Apologetics, but all the great programs that we produce here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Also, if you have a question for our guest, Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, you can also give us a call toll-free at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. And, so we got a lot of really cool stuff in store for us today. And let's see. Why don't we jump to our Finding the Fallacy, which the Finding the Fallacy is the Furtive Fallacy. You're probably saying to yourself, furtive, what does that mean? Well, according to the dictionary, furtive means an attempt to avoid notice or attention, typically because of guilt or a belief that discovery would lead to trouble. And so with that definition, if you look at the fallacy itself, it makes perfect sense, because this fallacy is an informal fallacy of emphasis in which outcomes are asserted to have been caused by hidden misconduct or wrongdoing by decision makers. And so the furtive fallacy is really the fallacy of all conspiracy theories, okay? And in that way, it's a very seductive fallacy. Basically, it occurs when certain outcomes are said to be caused by, these smoke-filled rooms behind the scenes by nefarious people who are pulling the strings of society. But there's no evidence, for such a causal thing. So it's very seductive, because if the people who are supposedly in these back rooms secretly causing these things to happen is true, and you don't like them, it's a lot easier to buy into the furtive fallacy than if they're people who you consider heroes, okay? For example, if there's a political party that you particularly dislike, and someone proposes that something bad is happening in society because of secret meetings and goings-on of members within that party that you don't like, I think it's much more attractive to buy into that furtive fallacy than not. And of course, if the group of people is somebody that you like, or at least are indifferent, it's a little harder to buy into that fallacy. So there is an emotional component to this. So what you need to be aware, so you don't get caught into conspiracy theories. If someone proposes something like the furtive fallacy, what you need to do is kind of push your emotions aside, and don't just identify a group and something bad that's happening and say A causes B. What you need to do is say, I want to see a causal link. Where's the smoking gun? How do you connect the secret party to whatever is happening? And if you can't show a direct cause, then that person's committing what's known as the furtive fallacy, which, like I said, in some ways I think this is probably the logical fallacy that blooms all these conspiracy theories that we hear today. So, you want proof. You want to bang your fist on the table or wherever you are and say, okay, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence. Just don't propose that there is group A causing group B. You got to show me the evidence that there is a link, right? Preferably a smoking gun, like some very explicit causal link. All right, so that's our Finding the Fallacy for today, the furtive fallacy. Let's go to the Meet the Early Church Father for today, who is St. Dionysius of Corinth, who flourished sometime around AD 166 or 174. Like I said, he's not the most popular saint out there. I doubt if anybody, if you heard that name, would say, oh, yeah, St. Dionysius of Corinth. Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with him. Chances are you're not, for the simple reason that we hardly know anything about him. So that could be a good reason why he's not on our top 10 list of early church fathers. The time of his episcopate as Bishop of Corinth can be roughly determined by the few scraps of writings that have come down to us from St. Dionysius. And interesting enough, both little scraps or fragments were both written to Pope St. Soter. Now, we know that Pope St. Soter ruled in the Roman Church from 166 AD to 174 AD, so therefore, hence, St. Dionysius of Corinth flourished, wrote his writings during that time. We only have two fragments. Both of them are preserved by Eusebius in his History of the Church. And the one I can read is, we'll just do a real short one, and it's an interesting one. He says this. He says that both Peter and Paul suffered martyrdom at the same time is affirmed as follows. Now, this is Eusebius saying, by Dionysius, Bishop of Corinth, to the Romans. Now, this is his letter to Pope St. Soter. He says, you have also, by your very admonition, brought together the planting that it was made by Peter and Paul at Rome and at Corinth. For both of them alike planted in Corinth and taught us, and both alike, teaching similarly in Italy, suffered martyrdom at the same time. So that is our early church father for today, Dionysius of Corinth. Coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to talk with Dr. Catherine Pakaluk about socialism. Stay tuned.
Leviticus 11:44 says, consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. St. Vincent Pallotti said, you must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy. God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is?
Will it be a boy?
Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Mary Ann Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. The question for today's program is, can a Catholic be a socialist? And to help us work through these issues, we have Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, who co-authored a book with our good friend Trent Horn called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? And I won't read the subtitle because that would give the answer away. Dr. Pakaluk is associate professor as social research and economic thought at Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Her primary areas of research include economics of education and religion, family studies and demography, Catholic social thought, and political economy. Pakaluk also is the recipient of the 2015 Acton Institute Novak Award, which is a prize given for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. And Dr. Pakaluk, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Hi, thanks for welcoming me. I'm delighted to be with you.
Yeah, it's nice to be with you as well. This is a fascinating area of study. I'm curious before we even begin, what led you into this area of study?
That's a great question. Actually, it's nice to be able to say that reading the popes actually is what led me into this area of study. So, although I'm a contemporary economist, I was trained, in sort of normal mainstream programs of economics. Looking into the history of ideas in relation to socialism is not something that most economists do these days. So,
Right.
when I first started reading about it was when I got to start teaching at a small Catholic college in Florida and down at Ave Maria, and I started teaching the social teaching of the Pope. So I started reading these texts from, the 1800s when the socialist movement was really kind of young and rising up. And I kind of thought, wait a minute, this is really interesting. This is really very strong and very interesting, and I didn't know any of this stuff. So I really enjoyed going through it with my students, and I was kind of a student with them, just reading through these older documents. And then, after many years of teaching it, I started to think, it would be possible to pull these things together and make, current Catholics more aware what the Church has been saying about socialism. So that's kind of how I got into it, a little bit of reading the popes and then, teaching it to my students.
Yeah, that's neat. So socialism is not a new thing. This has been around for quite a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, when did it start? What's the genesis of socialism?
Well, so there's we could kind of distinguish between socialism as kind of an abstract idea where you start to find some French thinkers around the time really of the French Revolution starting to think going beyond things like a Platonic or like Plato's Republic or other sorts of utopia type literature, which we know there were several different expressions of that over time. But when you get around the time of the French Revolution in France and a couple of other places, you start to see people saying, "Hey, you know what? This is the better way to organize things." So I would say it starts to coalesce as a political movement, in about the early 1800s, and then, really fueled by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and then some of the political expressions in the later 1800s. It starts to really pick up some steam. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. So, how would I guess the next question was, what is socialism? If we don't, maybe we've heard the word, but we never actually, thought about what it entails. What's entailed in socialism?
Well, so, obviously that, as you're saying, we don't think often, maybe because in part it's been co-opted in a lot of different ways. And a lot of people today, I think that socialism just means kind of, making sure we take care of everybody, making sure people don't fall through the cracks, which are really, those are admirable things, but that's not what socialism usually means. Historically. Yeah. So if we were to boil it down to kind of two main principles, there are many things that Marx and Engels were interested in, but if we just picked out two main particular things, the first would be the abolition of private property, and that could take place in different ways, through a single move on the part of the state to just confiscate private property, or certainly some communists and socialists have advocated an incremental approach to confiscation of private property through, so the reappropriation of private property, savings, and capital through, very extortionary levels of taxation. So the first thing would be the confiscation of private property, or the abolition of private property. And the second thing would be the nationalization or the state ownership of, you can use the Marxist term, the means of production, but we just think of like businesses and the economy. So the nationalization of various enterprises of production. So those are the two pillars, like no private property and kind of the nationalization of various enterprises and business.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the two would be related, wouldn't it? Because if the government is going to control the means of production and stuff, then by default, it can't be in the hands of the private sector.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So they definitely are connected, and usually somebody or another wants to talk about one thing without talking about the other, but that they are really connected. Just in the same way that we like to think in economic theory, we think about, there's producers and there's consumers in society. But in fact, nobody's just one or the other. Everybody needs things, but everybody also produces things. And so we're all tied together. So in the same way, when the socialists are kind of interested in the nationalization of business, they tend to need to confiscate large amounts of private property to get that done. Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. So another question I have is communism. What's the relationship between communism and socialism? Are they the same, or is there a distinction?
Yeah, so, most of if you were to consult sort of textbook definitions, most of the textbook definitions, you can find them in texts like sociological textbooks will say, for all practical purposes, these are kind of the same kind of thing. So certain, if we were to dig into sort of communist thought and socialist thought, some people will say, well, communism is kind of this end state that we're aiming at. So socialism is going to take us to this perfect communal living, this form of communal living. So communism is kind of the end state, and socialism is the way we're going to get there. But in other works, you can find kind of a reverse relationship. We certainly do think of communism today as having a much stronger sort of radical political expression. So people will say, well, I'm a socialist, but I'm not a radical communist, as if like that makes it better. So,
yeah, right.
Right. So, because we think of, those are the bad communists over there. So, I think that for the purposes of, general education, it's good not to think that they are very different. They tend to have sort of the same kinds of ideals and goals, and probably in general the same view of human nature. And that view of human nature, of course, is one of the things that the popes, radically resist in the socialist project.
Yeah, that perfectly leads to my next question, because, it's the church has only, at least to my knowledge, has only spoken out on a few ideas in economics and social structures, communism, socialism, unfettered capitalism, that type of thing. So what was it that provoked the popes to start addressing the socialist experiment?
Well, so I think at the time when we think of Pope Leo kicking this off with Rerum Novarum in 1891, but of course, actually, he wasn't the beginning. Pius IX before him really had some very harsh things to say about socialism. I think one of the reasons the popes chimed in is because, as always, the church is interested in sort of the good of humanity. That sounds like a very general term, but of course it is. That is the purview of the church. And at the time, in the mid to late 1800s, there was a lot of concern about revolution, right? And the socialists were in fact calling explicitly for revolution. And the church, tends to be for sort of patience and for peace. So the Pope said, well, wait a second, what's at the basis of these demands for revolution on the part of the socialists and the various kinds of socialists across Europe? And then the church starts to dig in and says, well, hang on a second. On some level, she sympathizes with the stated concerns of the socialists at the time. So the stated concerns are, the working class men and women are really, they're facing a tough lot in life. So up until that point, the church is kind of like, well, look, we're kind of with you there. We recognize that people are struggling and they're facing tough things, but we're not going to go there very far with you. So we don't think this means the abolition of private property and a kind of an uprising of the working class against the proletariat, right? There's not a class struggle here. At this moment, then the church says, no, this is a time for prudence, for caution, for restraint, and for wisdom, right? So that's when Pope Leo starts to say, well, what are the things that should motivate us in terms of political economy? And he starts to say, well, hang on a second, like what about private property? Actually, the church has always, going all the way back, certainly through the scholastics, Thomas Aquinas, and go back to St. Augustine, the fathers of the church, you can go all the way back. You find, actually, there's nobody in the Christian tradition that's advocating that we have to give up private property to be good men and women. And then the Pope says, actually, no, on the contrary, private property is the reason that we have wealth. It's actually what leads to wealth, and that's a good thing. And then he keeps going, and he says, and more than that, without private property, how do fathers and mothers take care of their children, which is their solemn obligation? So he starts to build a kind of set of principles which are really quite attractive, I think. And he says, hey, if we grab these principles, which the church has always espoused, there's no need for revolution, because what can happen is the church can help put envious thoughts to rest, greedy thoughts to rest, which the church says this is what motivates the socialists, is envy and greed. And we can actually, essentially work together with the church. We can our morals can be formed so we're not greedy, envious people. We can instead put our energy into hard work and thrift and savings. And actually, the Creator wants us to rise up out of poverty this way, and it will happen. So there's a lot of optimism in Pope Leo, where he says, because we're rejecting socialism, we're not telling working men and women that they have to stay poor. That's definitely not the answer. So I find that those documents very humane and very attractive for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. So basically, it's a form of government that detracts from or takes away the very means of which families can support themselves, and groups can cooperate with each other. Right.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So I like that you're talking about families and groups, because the church has always had this notion, which, it's basically attached to kind of Christian political thinking about civil society, kind of like this broad middle, what's supposed to be there. It's not supposed to be just the naked individual versus the big all-powerful state, right? Actually, what's supposed to populate the middle is families and groups, just as you've said. And actually, Pope Leo and then Pope Pius XI right after him, or just a little ways after him, after Pius X, spent a lot of time talking about how those groups can actually be fostered by the church. So think about like good Christian labor unions, the kinds of workers' movements, but those can be fostered by the church and applauded.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Dr. Catherine Pakaluk about can a Catholic be a socialist? More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. We'll be right back.
We finally did it. We have a Catholic Mental Health Conference on April 25th, 2020, here at the Sacred Heart Chapel with Dr. Louis Sandoval. He's going to be speaking on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Number one, he's going to go on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Second hour, depression, anxiety versus oppression and obsession. The third hour, bipolar disorders. Oh my gosh, infestation and possession. He's going to talk on mental health with the spiritual aspect. Number 4 talk will be on drug use, altered mental status versus demonic influence. I want to hear that talk. I hope you do too. Go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call us at 877-526-2151. The date is April 25th, 2020. Be there by calling 877-526-2151. God bless you. This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And we got a very interesting topic. It's, can a Catholic be a socialist? The answer is no. Here's why. That's the title of the book, written by Trent Horn and our guest, Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. And for those watching live stream, you'll be able to see the cover on your screen. And, yeah, fascinating subject. You know, over the break, Doctor, I was thinking, you know, in terms of personal property, the church has run into that a lot. But now, I don't know if you're familiar with the controversy with the poor Franciscans who believe that the gospel required, you know, the not having any property whatsoever. And the church spoke out against that. So, you know, the church does have skins in the game, so to speak, doctrinally speaking, as far as the right to personal property.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really interesting question. So the church's tradition has always distinguished between, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle. So, you know, I mean, in some ways, this is part of the old, there's nothing new under the sun, but there's a right and a wrong way to view it. And the church has always agreed with Aristotle that the right to property is distinct from its use, so that it's right, and in fact the only way to organize society sensibly, that everybody should kind of be responsible for a piece of property. I say be responsible because that's what the right means, right? The right to private property means you got to take care of this. And actually people who are homeowners know exactly what that means, especially men. You know, men and husbands go, oh yeah, it's not a right to private property, it's a burden. Like, I don't want to mow the lawn every Saturday. I don't want to be the guy that has to paint the house when the paint is peeling. But Aristotle said this very clearly about the common good in this way. He said, you know, the things that belong to the most people receive the least amount of care. So in fact, the right to have a piece of property is actually linked to the need for everything in creation to get taken care of. So men are sort of responsible to God to take care of creation, you know, and except for a couple of really foolhardy experiments, when we try kind of communal ownership, we find out that things don't get taken care of very well. Yeah. So there needs to be private ownership. But also, as Aristotle said, actually, because you own a thing, you take care of it. Doesn't mean you take care of it solely for your own benefit. That, in fact, the virtuous way to take care of property is to take care of it with a view towards the other people who depend upon the caregiver. So as a father of a family, right, or neighbors in a community or neighborhood, you don't merely think about your lawn being nice for your wife who likes to have a nice garden, but you might also think about the way in which taking care of your lawn also keeps property values higher for your neighbors, that it contributes to the common good. So the right to property is distinct from its use. Later in the Christian tradition, so someone like St. Thomas Aquinas really develops this idea that the wealthy and people who are blessed with an extra special amount of property or wealth have sincere and very serious obligations to give of their excess to the poor. So because you have a right to private property doesn't relieve you from the duty of giving to others and relieving their need. So, you know, but this doesn't happen, and it can't sensibly happen in sort of a very top-down kind of forced way. It takes away both the personal obligation for which we answer to God and, you know, and sort of the principles of social order, right? It cannot be the case that, you know, you've got some official who comes in and says, well, here's how much you've got to give to the poor this week, right? It takes away the merit, but it also takes away the social order, right? Because who's to say that that official is wise, and who's to say that that official could see the common good clearly? So that's really an interesting principle, and it's the kind of thing that when you start to dig into the church's teachings, as you've said, the church has some skin in the game. She's thought about this for a long time.
Yeah, very good. So, are there different kinds of socialism, or is it all basically the same thing with, just different dresses? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Different exteriors.
Well, so I would say that in terms of the goals of socialism, they tend to be quite similar across the board. But in reality, since socialism is the church will use this language, contra natura, right? It's against nature. It doesn't ever. I can't think of a time or a place when true, complete, authentic, full socialism has been implemented. There's always sort of exceptions and difficulties because, in fact, people don't give up private property that easily, and they don't give up the ties they have to their families very easily. To your question, you do have a variety of political expressions. In other words, tyrannical or dictatorial regimes in different places that have managed to confiscate more or less amounts of private property, or have managed to nationalize greater or fewer. So we can think of, say, China today, which is, not a free and open political society. It's a place that has absolutely espoused and adopted many of the ideals of the communists. But in fact, they have a degree of market openness, which we understand. And then you could think of places like the former Soviet Union, in which there was neither political freedom nor any market freedom. So there are definitely kind of hybrid expressions of this political movement in different places. And then you can think of places today, which, like if I'm going to move into this term democratic socialism, which people like Bernie Sanders or AOC will talk about, what are they talking about? Are they talking about classical socialism in the fullest sense? Well, no, not really. There's certainly, the ideals, I think, are quite similar, but they're getting at something more like a capitalist society with a very generous welfare state. Right. So there's a distinction there, although they're going to still use this term socialism. It's been a malleable term. It gets used in lots of different ways. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, the church has spoken out against socialism, but is it really one size fits all? If anybody claims to be a socialist, they could say, well, this is a different kind of socialism, not the old-fangled thing that didn't work before. We can make it work now.
Right. No, and we pick up on that a little bit in a couple of chapters in the last section of our book. It's not our goal or our plan to weigh in on any particular politicians, or their platforms. We want to just lay out the principles. Here are the principles by which we can evaluate the various claims and ideas that the socialists have, and we let our readers try to decide what any particular candidate stands for. But I do want to say that although the term has been somewhat malleable, I think it's because the term hasn't suffered enough ill repute, right? So we wouldn't talk about, like a nicer form of murder, right? We would say well, this is the nice kind of murder. There's, sort of true and authentic, like hate, murder motivated by hatred, but then there's kind of the good intention murder over here. In fact, when we want to talk about murder with good intentions, we give it a different name. We talk about euthanasia. We talk about it because we know that people aren't going to stomach sort of a nice idea about murder. And actually, so that's, I think, one of the things I find really interesting about socialism. If you look at those early popes who talked about socialism, they viewed socialism as right on a par with theft and greed and like the worst kind of expressions of public life, right? So I think to someone like Pope Leo, the idea of sort of like a nice kind of socialism, or this time it will work, would have sounded sort of like us trying to sanitize the language of murder or the language of theft or crime. Like, we're going to have nice crime this time around, democratic crime. I'm thinking out loud a little bit, pushing these word boundaries a little bit. But I do think the reason we get these revised versions of socialism constantly cropping up is because somehow or another the term socialism hasn't kind of gotten the bad connotation that it ought to.
Yeah, that's really surprising to me because, after experiencing the Soviet Union, and National Socialism and Nazi Germany,
right? Yeah,
you would think that people would run if they saw anything that even looked similar to those things. Why do you suppose? Absolutely. How do you explain this amnesia?
Well, so a couple of things. I think that part of the amnesia must be related to fallen human nature, right? So that's fair to say. So remember at the beginning, Pope Leo says, right in like the first line, he says, really the reason the socialists have any success is because they're trading on the envy that we have in all of our hearts. We have envy. We're all envious. It's part of being fallen. And so I think that the reason it doesn't go away completely is because every generation there's somebody that can envy somebody else for something. And we're just envious people. We're people just like we're greedy people, and we want to eat too much, and we have all these things that are from sin. And so, someone asked me earlier, for instance, this current wave of interest in socialism that we're seeing among, say, younger people. A lot of that is younger people envying not the rich per se, but they're envying the older generation, their parents' generation, and maybe their grandparents who saved and are now enjoying the fruits of their savings. And the young people are looking at that like, it's impossible that I could save that much. So maybe they should just share more with me. The early popes wouldn't have hesitated to say that's envy. You guys should just, work hard and grow in virtue just like your grandparents did.
Great points. It's you're right, because usually that appeal to envy, to the one percenters or something like that. That seems to be the driving force to bring people into the ranks of, let's just divest everybody of this wealth, and we'll figure out who gets what.
Yeah, they always want to start by focusing on somebody who has something that seems outrageous for someone to have, someone who has nice houses, or someone who has, offshore bank accounts or whatever. I mean, you could always get into that game, like who has too much or whatever, but it's like it's distracting attention, right? Like we're distracting attention from sort of the things which ought to be the aims of public life and political life, which is kind of cultivating virtue.
Yeah, and like you said, with property, that if you have a lot of wealth, then you have a greater duty to support the common good and the poor. And, that's, if there's a problem with people who are super wealthy, it's really because they're not living up to Catholic ideals. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the tradition's been so clear on that, just think about forget about the super rich. We're always worried about the super rich. In fact, the super rich in this country give away more than anyone in history. But are we tithing? Are we who are not super rich? Are we giving away our 10%?
Yeah, that's a great point. We're chatting with Dr. Catherine Pakaluk about Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? A new book with Trent Horn. And we're going to have more on the other side of the break, so stay tuned, everybody.
In Luke 7, Jesus said, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven her, because she has been shown great love. According to St. John of the Cross, Christians should always remember that the value of their good works is not based on number and excellence. Their value is based on the love for God that prompts them to do the works. May we always be motivated by true love for God, and not worry so much about what we do, but why we do it.
We finally did it. We have a Catholic Mental Health Conference on April 25th, 2020, here at the Sacred Heart Chapel with Dr. Louis Sandoval. He's going to be speaking on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Number one, he's going to go on the basics of mental illness versus what we consider normal. Second hour, depression, anxiety versus oppression and obsession. The third hour, bipolar disorders. Oh my gosh, infestation and possession. He's going to talk on mental health with the spiritual aspect. Number 4 talk will be on drug use, altered mental status versus demonic influence. I want to hear that talk. I hope you do too. Go to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call us at 877-526-2151. The date is April 25th, 2020. Be there by calling 877-526-2151. God bless you.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Dr. Catherine Pakaluk about Can a Catholic be a Socialist? The answer is no, and here's why. New book by Catholic Answers Press. And, Doctor, you mentioned that the church shows that socialism is contrary to nature. And the funny thing about nature is if you go contrary to it, bad things happen, right? If you don't believe in gravity and you walk off your roof, bad things happen. Tell us how has socialism fared as as an experiment?
Oh gosh, it fails every single time, and that's it's a thing that it doesn't give me any pleasure to report, because if it's out there to report it, that people are really suffering. We talk about Venezuela, which is really the most current kind of pressing example of the evil damage of socialist policies in a country like Venezuela, which was so wealthy and was sort of one of the jewels of the South American economy. But so this is just terrible and tragic. But one of the great ways to think about how it doesn't work out is, as many people have pointed out, and we mentioned in the book, socialist countries are always ones where you have to build walls to keep people in them, right? And capitalist countries are places where you have to build walls to keep people out. In other words, if we just look at what people do when they vote with their feet, they don't want to remain in socialist countries, even if they're not experiencing the worst evils that a socialist economy can experience. And what are those worst evils? Vast amounts of shortages in basic goods like medicines and basic food and meat and just huge, massive food shortages, oil shortages, shortages in all the basic necessities, and certainly very quickly in most cases, the lack even of, sort of ordinary levels of intermediate kind of goods, so the comforts of things, so you look at Cuba, for instance, another place that was really a lovely, lovely place, but totally, totally destroyed by socialism.
Yeah. What about, sometimes we hear about, in your book, you call it the Nordic myth, that there are these socialist utopias in Europe. Is that true?
Yeah, no, it's funny. So this is one of those cases where people are mixing something up. I mean, so the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, these are countries that have been happy to have higher levels of what we'll call social welfare. So they have higher tax rates in some cases, and they distribute more. The state takes on a few more of the social functions. But in fact, the last time we looked, there's a couple of different indexes you can look at, places like the Heritage Foundation that rank things like economic freedom. And the Nordic countries rank right up there neck and neck with the United States in terms of how much economic freedom they have. So these are not socialist countries. It's not like, well, gee, in Norway, this is a place where people are really thriving, but they have confiscated private property and, they've nationalized the businesses. These are thriving capitalist countries. They just have very higher levels of, we'll just say, tax and transfer programs or redistributive programs. And that's a kind of choice. I mean, countries can make those kinds of choices based on prudence, and Catholics can support a variety of levels of social welfare programs. But it's so important not to call these things socialist because it helps to sanitize what socialism really is, right? It kind of makes us I don't know, like a little less worried about it. Like, well, if Norway is socialist, why should we be so worried about it, right?
Yeah.
So someone asked about, on a radio show, Catholic Answers, recently someone asked about Canada. Isn't Canada a socialist country? You kind of, no, it's not actually. It's not socialist at all. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So, you talk a lot also about capitalism. Are there bad things about capitalism? What has the church pointed out as far as, warning signs, things to avoid, or what's not permissible?
In terms of capitalism, So this is really a great question. Let's go back to Rerum Novarum, where the Pope actually thinks that the easy thing in Rerum Novarum is to denounce socialism, and he only devotes the first, several handfuls of paragraphs to denouncing socialism. And then he says, but what are we going to do once we've denounced socialism? He says, well, we still have to deal with the fact that the working class need help, right? That things aren't running the way they should be running. And so then he talks a lot about what we would think now, we look back, we would say, well, actually, he was developing a kind of list of things like the rights of the workers, right? He was talking about the importance of Christian labor unions. People often forget that when the popes defended the right to labor unions, they had in mind Christian labor unions, right? They had in mind workers who would come together and read the gospel together. And then actually the popes also said, and by the way, there shouldn't just be workers unions, there should be Christian associations of business owners who get together and encourage each other in these good principles. So little by little, over the course of maybe that first 100 years of Catholic social thought, the popes are kind of working out these various ideas. Well, there's nothing wrong intrinsically with capitalism. In fact, it looks like a perfectly good system. She's not in the business of baptizing things that are okay. The church isn't sort of like, well, capitalism is now baptized. She just says, look, looking at it squarely, the language of Pope Pius XI was looking at it squarely. There's nothing vicious about it. Capitalism isn't vicious. But like anything else, like a neighborhood association or your local grocery store, if it's populated by vicious people who are craven and it's steeped in sin, it will just not work out very well, right? There's nothing wrong with a grocery store, but if everybody's running around, doing bad things behind each other's backs, right? You could just imagine it'd be a terrible grocery store, but the problem wouldn't be the grocery store. The problem would be that it's, run by people who are not imbued with Christian principles, a Christian charity. So we have to distinguish between whether the structures themselves are right or wrong, and then the people who inhabit them. So just because we've accepted capitalism as a reasonable system doesn't mean it's fine just on its own. So the language the popes used was, we need to adjust the capitalist order, adjust it according to principles of right order. So, if we find that it's impossible for a mother to stay home with her children, Pope Leo says, for instance, then that would be an unjust order. And so we might think about, well, what are the kinds of things that would make it easier? Is it some kind of leave policies or some kinds of worker protections that prevent people from being, separated from their families? So the church has always encouraged Christians to sit down and think hard about how to adjust the capitalist system to reflect deeply held and important Christian beliefs about the importance of the family, the dignity of workers, and all those kinds of things. So on that point, of course, she just says, well, look, this is your task. You Christian lay people, this is your task. But she's not ever giving any kind of blueprint. She's just saying, well, here's some things you should think about, but they need to be concretized into different political times and circumstances, right?
Yeah, very good. So, why don't we talk about some of the guiding principles that Catholics ought to use to evaluate these different projects?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a big question. I think that, one thing that may be important to say is that I think, let me just pull out another phrase from Pope Leo. I never tire of getting insights from the popes, and I think there's something we talked already earlier about idea of things being against nature. Well, when Pope Leo talked about that, another way that he put that is he said, I think he put it this way: nothing is more important than to see the world as it really is. So he advocated a kind of Christian realism And he thought that realism both would give us courage to accept things as they are. So we accept that, like, I wasn't born into a wealthy family that maybe passed on lots of saved up wealth. But I'm also, as a realist, I know that I'm a daughter of God and that I have talents and that I can work and save. And so he thought that realism was a kind of balance between two kinds of extremes. One would be like a hopelessness, and the other would be like an over ambitiousness, he thought. So yeah. I think that kind of realism lends itself to a lot of principles that are politically prudent, such as we aren't going to inherit in any place or time a system which kind of gets everything right all the time, and that it's okay to work incrementally towards a better order. So the important thing would be to kind of go through and say, well, like, how does this particular proposal, this politician or this, how does it view private property? Is it full of all kinds of rants against the rich people, right? That's class warfare. That's not something the church is behind. If you kind of work through this, how does it think about workers and the ability of workers to save and to practice thrift? How does it think about, say, education or the kinds of things that, again, the popes would praise and say, how do you help people rise up? Well, education is one thing. So, I mean, it would be important to pick through those things because, in fact, in a certain way, we can say that political regimes or political orders are they're like policy. We think about what's policy, but policy you can't do in general. You can't say, we're going to have conservative policy. Well, that doesn't yet mean anything, right? What is conservative policy with respect to the family? What is it with respect to education? What is it with respect to health? What is it with respect to labor markets? You actually just can't do it in general. It has to be very specific, and that's actually what prudence helps us with. Prudence is sort of specific wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. So the important thing then would be sort of not to become grandiose, to think that kind of the church has some like big plan, and if we just get all these pieces in place, we're just going to have this perfect society. We won't. But it is important. And so then each of us, for the most part, most of us are not called to work out the details in all the areas. But many of us have expertise in one area or another. Teachers, right? Healthcare workers, businessmen, business owners, entrepreneurs. They all have certain amounts of expertise. And so I would envision, these kinds of ways for people to get together as the popes recommended and to think through, like, well, gee, what are the ways that Christian entrepreneurs can be most generous with their workers and their employees in the phase of a startup of a business, which is a really fragile time for a business. Are there any tricks? Are there things? Are there best practices? That kind of thing, right? So you'd want to see, like, Catholic business networks and things like that, just as we're starting to see Catholic medical networks, Catholic healthcare networks. That would all be sort of really desirable and really helpful for us to think through the specific policy questions.
Yeah, very good. Wow, just I have a lot of notes I got to reread. I'm going to reread your book. Okay. And speaking about your book, where can people go to get a copy?
Sure. Well, I know two great places to go. So Catholic.com, which is the Catholic Answers site, Catholic.com, it's available, and then Amazon.com, it is available. It's saying it's out of stock, but I know it's shipping this week. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. I really appreciate
welcome.
it.
Glad to chat with you, Gary.
All right. Well, yeah, feelings mutual. That is Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, and the book is Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Available through Catholic Answers Press. Well, it's unbelievable. The hour is over. It's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here, but never fear. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. So I hope everybody enjoyed the program. Thank you so much for listening, and God willing, we will talk again tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
I'm a soldier for Christ.